In my studio, I have extremely diffuse LED lighting on the ceiling, but even with that, you can see how much glare comes off certain colors. The blue in particular is really greasy. Blacks, I find in oil paint are really greasy, and they hold a luster where some of the other ones, like this yellow, some of the oranges, are naturally less glossy. So the varnish really unifies the whole painting and takes all these sheens, knocks them down into a single layer of matteness, which makes it ultimately easier to photograph. The thing that makes a varnish is the fact that it stays soluble even after it dries. So in the future, if somebody decides that they want to remove the varnish, they can do so with a mineral spirits or some other type of solvent. The matte varnish that I use, I make out of two ingredients. The first ingredient is a Gamvar gloss varnish made by Gamblin. If I didn't mix anything into this, obviously it would be gloss. But to make it matte, I mix into it this. It is also made by Gamblin. It's called a cold wax medium. It's basically white beeswax and a solvent. So the idea is that I am going to take the gloss varnish, add the beeswax to it, mix it up vigorously, and then you have a matte varnish. So this container that I'm using for this demonstration is just a simple jar of tomato sauce that we had for dinner tonight. I cleaned it, took the label off, and I'm going to mix the varnish in this container. First, I'm going to stick this metal ball in there, put on some rubber gloves, and pour in as much of the varnish as will fit. Into that now I'm going to use my palette knife and just scoop in some beeswax. It's just a white wax. Has an interesting smell. I'm not sure if this is completely watertight. I hope it is, but just to be sure, I'm gonna cover it up with a piece of paper towel so I don't get it all over me if it does leak. You just shake it vigorously for a few minutes. You let it sit for a few minutes and all the air bubbles will come to the top. And you'll see there's still some chunks floating in the bottom, so I'm gonna need to mix this more. It definitely takes a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes of mixing it so you can see the chunks in there still. All right, after it looks like you got all the chunks dissolved, add some more wax and do it again. I didn't say it was easy, but it will make your paintings look better. And I do think they sell a matte varnish, but there's no way they have this much beeswax in it, so I don't think it'll be as matte as if you made it yourself. Regardless of the type of varnish you choose to use, there are two things you need to make sure before you apply the varnish. Number one, the painting needs to be cured or dry. This painting in particular has been drying for about 4 months, so it is definitely dry enough to apply a varnish. The second thing is you need to make sure that it's clean. I use a simple lint roller that I get at a grocery store and clean off the dust and the dog hairs and the particles before I apply the varnish, because the varnish will seal in any of the junk and then you'll never be able to get it off. I wanted to take a minute to talk about the differences between a matte varnish and a gloss varnish, because I'm not saying necessarily that a matte varnish is the best. It really depends on your taste and your style and what you're trying to achieve with your painting. If you are the type of painter that does a lot of blending on canvas and you're using a lot of shading and shadowing, then and it's realistic, matte varnish might not be the best solution for you, and in that case you might want to go with a satin or a gloss varnish. The painting style that I'm using lately is more of a block color, hard edge, modern, poppy kind of style. So because of the solid blocks of color, I find that unifying it with a matte appearance improves the overall look of the painting, and it definitely makes it easier to photograph. And when it's easier to photograph, it looks better online and on all the stores where I have my artwork for sale. But basically, you should probably do a test to see if the matte varnish is doing what you hope it to do, because if you are painting in a style where you're using thick brush strokes and there's a lot of color in the brush strokes, the matte varnish might dull it down a little bit too much, and in that case you might want to go with a gloss varnish. If you're doing a lot of blending with your work, again, you might like that wet look. Lets the blending portion really pop out, gives it a depth. But if you're painting in a more modern style, like I am currently, and you're using hard edges, the matte varnish can make that look better if that's the way you think. Definitely make it easier to photograph. So I'm not saying in this video that the matte varnish is the best, but you should test and try out different methods, and if you're interested in trying out the matte varnish, this is the way to do it. All right, so back to the painting. You might be asking at this point, well, how do I know if my painting is dry enough to varnish? I think there are two rules of thumb. The first, a lot of people say that if you take your thumbnail and press it into the thicker areas of paint, if it leaves a mark, then it might not be dry enough. If the paint is dry enough, it should be able to withstand pressing with your fingernail. The second way I test it is to take a little bit of Gamsol or whatever thinner you're using on a Q-tip. Just rub a little area with a Q-tip on your painting. If the paint comes off onto the Q-tip, it's not dry enough. If you varnish a painting when it's not dry enough, the varnish will likely re-dissolve your paint and spread it around and completely mess it up. So you don't want to do that. Traditionally, with gloss varnishes, the recommendation is to use a varnish brush or something like this, where it has relatively soft bristles, a wide brush, and you brush the varnish on evenly across the whole painting and then wipe off any excess with a cloth. I have not had success with that method. I think some of it has to do with the fact that my paintings are fairly large, so the amount of area, it just takes a long time, and by the time you get to the end, where you started gets a little bit tacky, and I've never had success with wiping off varnish and not leaving little things of lint all over your painting. I've tried lint-free cloths of various kinds. I have yet to find one that is actually lint-free. So I've come up with a different way of doing it. I use these little mohair rollers. This particular one is made by Worcester. Fits onto a mini roller like this. I just get these at my local hardware store. I take the varnish that I just mixed. I pour some into this Chinese food container top. You can use anything you want. And I use the roller to carefully apply it to my painting after I clean it with the lint roller. The key with varnish, no matter what kind you're using, is to use as little as possible. So basically you want the coat to be thin as you could possibly get it. So don't overdo it. Just start out slow and just drag that bit of varnish as far as you can drag it until the roller is completely dry again. Then add more and keep going and keep going. You don't want to put too much on, because the more you put on, the more is going to pool up and will be glossy. So we don't want that to happen. You want it to be as thin as possible. Also, I've learned that you don't necessarily, on a big painting like this, you don't want to necessarily do it on a wall. I like to do it flat so that the varnish just kind of dries evenly. It doesn't fill up in your brush strokes. If you do thick brush strokes and you hang it on the wall, the varnish could wind up pooling up in the thick brush strokes, and it doesn't come out as even as if you laid it flat on a table. Here we are the following day. The varnish is dry, and you can see that it does still glare a little bit, but the glare is much more dispersed and diffuse and even across the whole painting. Next step is to put it back on the wall, take some photographs of it, pack it up, and ship it off.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Clear. 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.